Now, one thing I've been noticing is that code doesn't seem to work the same as it used to. This issue caused billions of dollars worth of financial loss. It's been a tough couple of weeks. So the question is, what happened? Is it just me, or does it seem like nothing works the way it should? It seems like when it comes to software and hardware, there seems to be bugs and problems left and right. In particular, it's been a very interesting couple of weeks. We had NASA announcing that they had to delay another mission to the moon. We've been seeing headlines about Intel and the 13 and 14 series of chips. And two things I'm going to focus on in this video. We've seen the fact that WordPress, even though it was just released a 6.6 version, literally just 2 weeks ago, needed a patch update. And then of course we had the Crowdstrike situation where the internet all over the world had issues, in particular with Microsoft services. It's been a tough couple of weeks. All right, so let's talk about it. What I want to do first is talk about the Crowdstrike situation. And the reason is because that's the most impactful one. It impacted banking, it impacted airlines, it impacted Microsoft 365 services. Businesses and organizations were getting the infamous blue screen of death. And as of this recording, airlines are still facing difficulties. So what happened here? And that's why even though I do use Windows, I do have a Linux laptop and an Apple laptop over here as well. I have backups in my backups, and in case anything goes wrong, I have a way to continue working. All right, so let's talk about Crowdstrike and the internet situation and the Microsoft services issue, and what can we learn from it? What caused it? What's the takeaways, and what can we do to prevent it in the future? And you're gonna find an underlying theme here between the Crowdstrike situation and the next topic of WordPress 6.6, having to have a patch release update within 10 days of the initial release. All right, so from Crowdstrike, the initial report was the fact that there was a corrupted patch file that was pushed out to servers all over the world. And because the patch file was corrupted, it caused some systems to get the blue screen of death. That we already know. But the question is, how does something like this happen? If you've been following my channel, you know some of my recommendations in terms of making sure you have a development environment and a production environment. Obviously, if you have a website, you have a production environment, it's online. But if you have a developer environment, you can test out all your code, you can test out all the updates, and you can make sure they're compatible with what you have. Now, that's important even if you're not a developer. And the reason is because you want to make sure that any updates that are released doesn't have a negative impact on your production environment. So what you do is you have a replication or you have a duplication of what you have online. And you have a nice, safe environment, a developer environment in your local system, and it should emulate or be a direct mirror of what you have online in terms of the PHP, in terms of the MySQL, in terms of the Linux distribution, things of that nature. You want to, as closely as possible, mirror what you have in production on your development environment. By doing that, you can check out anything that's taking place, any updates before they get released. Now, the thing is, Crowdstrike says they did that. And I'm pretty confident they do because they are a major cybersecurity firm. Part of their report was the fact that they actually did test their updates internally in their developer environment. So the question is, what happened? What caused such a massive outage? I mean, if everything was working fine in the developer environment, when they released the patch file, why did that cause an issue in the production zone? That's the billion-dollar question, because it's figured that this issue caused billions of dollars worth of financial loss. Now, files get corrupted all the time. You're working on something locally in your developer environment and you see that it's working fine. And somewhere, somehow, maybe that file gets corrupted. That does happen. Less so nowadays and less so in enterprise level systems. You're gonna find that on your regular, everyday, commercially purchased type of computer or laptop or software, there's going to be often some bugs within either the hardware or the software itself. And I'm talking about for everyday personal use, right? These are not the enterprise level types of hardware and software. But once you get to that level, once you get the enterprise level hardware and software, what you're going to find is that they have error correcting memory. That's different from your standard memory you have in your computer. That accounts for the possibility that something's going to get corrupted in the transmission of information. You're going to see there's redundancy in the systems themselves. And especially once you start getting to the enterprise and the governmental type of code and software, often what happens is they go through a very rigorous protocol in terms of testing. And even then, there's often issues. All right, so We know that Crowdstrike is a major firm. It's a major cybersecurity firm. I'm assuming they have some of the best developers and some of the best people on staff making sure that everything works properly. Now, I don't know how they have their environment set up, but this is what I would think they would have. They obviously have their developer environment. They have their code is going to be peer reviewed, meaning they're going to have multiple developers looking at the code and they're going to check for any issues in the actual logic of the code itself. That's in-house in the developer environment itself. Now, the thing is, another layer that I don't often talk about, but I have mentioned previously, is the fact that you don't only have a developer environment and a production environment, but you should also have a staging environment. So what is that? So we have our local developer environment where we do our code. And again, it should, as closely as possible, mirror what you have on your production website or piece of code. So once you introduce staging environment, what you do is you have the developer environment, you test out your code there, you release it to your staging environment, which is actually online and should be an exact mirror of what you have in your production zone. That way, any bugs for whatever reasons that might not have been noticed in your developer environment, you'll catch it at staging. Once you do your rigorous testing there, then you release it to the production zone. That's typically what you should do. So you have 3 zones. You have your developer, your staging, and your production. Now that's a lot of work on the side of Crowdstrike, and it was their patch update, so pretty much the onus is on them. But that doesn't mean that Microsoft or that some of these other organizations or companies don't have culpability as well. Now, one thing I've been noticing is that code doesn't seem to work the same as it used to. There seems to be a lot more bugs being introduced as new updates take place. That's why I'm not a fan of automatic updates. There's a lot of trust you put into a system when you say, you know what, I'm going to let you update without me actually reviewing what's taking place. So what I typically do is I stop all automatic updates. I make sure that I back everything up. You need to have multiple, hard drives, and you have to have multiple systems in place to prepare for an issue that will probably eventually come up. And you have to have a game plan. What's going to happen when something like this happens again? Because it probably will. Your backup strategy and your implementation of getting back online, that strategy has to be robust. It has to be tested, and you always have to be ready. So my first thing is no automatic updates. No matter how good the organization is, never trust the code. I mean, think about it. Everybody makes mistakes, right? And we're in a transitionary period where a lot of people, a lot of organizations are dependent on artificial intelligence. So yeah, there's going to be some growing pains within multiple fields. And that segues into the next topic I want to talk about, which is the WordPress 6.6 release, which came out about 2 weeks ago. Now, in the previous video, I said WordPress releases have been quite stable. And yeah, this one did not meet that criteria. But at least there weren't that many issues that caused the system to crash for the majority of users. What happened was there were some compatibility issues with some page builders and some themes, and there were issues with the UI or the way the user interface looked when there were underlines under links that maybe the theme and the person didn't want it, but it was implemented because of the specificity of the CSS. Now the thing is, WordPress is huge. It's a very large system. There are over 1 million lines of code at this point in the core software itself. And when you start looking at the fact that there are thousands of themes available, there are thousands of plugins available, there's multitude of different types of configurations in terms of how you have your server set up. There are different PHP versions that people might have installed on their servers. There's a lot of things you have to take into consideration. So what you've probably seen in some previous videos of mine that is the fact that I tell people you should check out the beta tester plugin. You should have your local developer environment. You should take what you have in your production site, make sure you have it in your local developer environment as well. And again, as closely as possible, mirror what you have online. Try to get the environment to be as close to it as possible. You want to make sure you install your theme the same way. You want to make sure you're running the same version of WordPress. You want to make sure you have the same plugins installed. You want to make sure that you are running the same version of Linux if possible. You want to make sure you have all the packages and the modules that you're going to need to have your system function locally as you would in a production zone. And then what you want to do is make sure you have an exact copy of your database downloaded from your production site to your local developer environment. That way you can actually visually see if there's any changes within the presentation of your site, or if there's any incompatibility issues. And then you should definitely use some developer plugins that will identify any issues within the code itself. Any issues with the PHP, any issues with the JavaScript, any issue with the database calls, things of that nature. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but the reality is it'll save you a lot of headaches, because if you do test locally first, you can actually test out the next iteration of WordPress before it's actually released for production sites. And that way you get a head start into determining, are there going to be any potential issues? And that's what I do. I test locally, and I try to test as rigorously as possible. So, Joel, why didn't you catch these bugs? Well, it's the nature of my setup. I'm a classic theme developer and a hybrid theme developer. I don't use page builders. So all the issues that would have impacted the page builders didn't impact the way my code or my themes function. So maybe I got to get my hands on some of these page builders and start diving into them, put them as part of my, testing environment and seeing what they will potentially do with future iterations of WordPress. And then I'll note down my issues that I find, and then I'll submit them to the support channels that WordPress has to make sure they can be aware before they go to production sites. So I'm going to start doing that more on my side. Again, I typically test for the classic integration of WordPress and also the hybrid development. But why did this happen? Why is it that other developers didn't necessarily catch it in their initial releases? Because you got to look at the way that WordPress operates. They don't just go from one version to another. They have their developer environments. They have a bunch of talented developers worldwide working on the platform. But at the same time, again, there are so many different possible scenarios. There are so many themes. There are so many page builders. There's a lot of plugins. There's so many different configurations that a person might have set up. It's hard to try to catch everything. So you look at the fundamentals, you look at the basics, you look at what's going to impact the vast majority of people out there. And it's easier to do with the themes and plugins they have in the repository of WordPress, but it's harder to do with the premium third-party page builder solutions, themes, and plugins that you're going to find everywhere else that's not on WordPress.org. So I'll reach out to Divi, and I'll reach out to Elementor, and I'll reach out to Bricks and some of the other page builder organizations, and I'll see if I can do some testing on their code locally over here and just do some stuff on the side, because I think that beyond just providing the input to the WordPress team itself, there's a lot of other third-party plugins, themes, and developers that provide services and sell themes and sell plugins that, will need to be tested. And ultimately, I think that part of the strategy I mentioned for Crowdstrike in terms of the developer environment, the staging environment, and the production environment holds true here as well. If you look at some of my previous videos, I've done a lot of videos on testing your code, making sure you have unit tests, making sure you have code checkers, code linters. You try to find situations where your code won't work. Even the edge cases that you think might not happen, but there's a possibility it could. So yeah, if you have WordPress 6.6 and if you haven't updated to the latest version, which is 6.6.1, now's the time to do that. But again, make sure you take a backup of your site. Download all your files, your folders, your assets, your images, anything you have on your production site, download it and save it in a safe location. And then export a copy of your database. You want to make sure you have multiple backups of your site and your database. And then you could also export the actual post and pages and all your custom post types just by using the native export feature. And I believe in backing up your backups. You just never know. It adds another layer of responsibility for us, but at the same time, think about it. If your site goes down, are you going to lose business? Or are you going to have issues getting it back up? Are you going to be able to do it yourself? Or are you going to have to hire somebody? How much money will be lost if your website or app goes offline? So yeah, it seems like nothing seems to work anymore. Or it seems like nothing seems to work as it should. Now, part of that is, again, the complexity of the code. When you keep something very simple, it's easy to find bugs. It's easy to test. But the bigger, the larger the system gets, the more difficult it is to look for every single possible edge case. But you got to try to think about and account for what can possibly happen and how can I prepare for that. If you do that, you're going to be in a better position. All right, as for NASA having to delay their mission to the moon again, now that's concerning. These are rocket scientists. That's way above my pay grade, so I'm not even going to start commenting too much on that. But what I do know is in the late 1960s, we were able to send a man to the moon. And today, it seems like it's getting even more difficult to do that. So what's happened? When in the 1960s, the computer on the shuttle then was nowhere near as possible as the phones we carry around in our pockets every day. You know, the one we use to take cat videos. Something's changed. And when it comes to Intel, I don't know. That seems very interesting. The 13 series and 14 series of chips have issues. They have some type of release they're gonna push out within August, and hopefully that doesn't cause more issues as well. So like I said, whether it's your website or your computer, make sure you back that thing up. And maybe it's time to, dust off an old laptop and install Linux on it and get something that you can work with in case there's another issue with Microsoft. My prediction is we're going to have some growing pains in the next couple of years, especially when we start integrating artificial intelligence directly within the hardware. There are exciting times, there's an endless amount of possibilities, but with change, there's going to be hiccups, there's going to be issues that present themselves, and we have to be mindful of that. We're going to have to keep legacy systems around just in case our more advanced and modern systems, for whatever reasons, no longer work. Alright, so sound off. What did Crowdstrike's issue with the internet outage and the patch file being corrupted, what did that do to you? Did you miss your flight? Did you have issues with banking? I know me, I wasn't able to gas up because I had no cash on me, and the credit card systems were down. That means you always have to have cash on hand. You just never know. And with WordPress, were you impacted by the latest release, by the latest update of 6.6? If so, let me know how. And what's your strategy? What's your recommendations? And what's your opinions on some of these issues? Sound off down below. Alright, thanks for watching. You know what to do. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe. Share this video with some other people. Let them know what's taking place. And I'll catch you in the next video. Happy coding.